Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post coming to you from New York City. We're in Times Square, which represents the intersection of many things American. This is where the worlds of commerce, entertainment, and the news media meet. We're here to talk about the news media. As the 2016 presidential election campaign heads into the homestretch, many Americans are accusing their news outlets, particularly on the broadcast side, of not just reporting on the race for the White House, but actually affecting the outcome through their commercial agendas, prioritizing ratings and revenues over journalism and responsible reporting. One broadcast executive who was based just up the road from here summed it up this way: Donald Trump may not be good for America, but he's damn good for CBS News, which might explain why it is that so much of the coverage has looked and sounded like this.
He is a great entertainer.
In your opinion, because that's what you want to spin it. No, that's how you want to spin it.
Voters spoke out last night and handed the anti-establishment
say that word a lot, but what does it mean?
Disgusting speech that we heard tonight that does nothing but bring out the darkness in America.
Well, you gotta understand, I'm only supporting Donald Trump because he's the last one left. It's a mud wrestle. It is a mud wrestle.
How often do we sit here and argue? But I'm saying
Every day.
The guy's actually a loser. He really has no plans whatsoever. Why does he continue to say that? Because it's true.
So how did we get here? How did America find itself in a place where so many voters, and not just a few voices here and there, are blaming their news media for the rise of Donald Trump, a candidate many Republicans, let alone Democrats, consider to be dangerous? Measuring the totality of the media coverage over the entire presidential election campaign, the content, the tone, the ideology, is near impossible. There's just too much of it. But what we can do is examine structural issues in the American broadcasting landscape, and there are two areas in which broadcast media in the U.S. are unique.
First, this country's regulatory requirement for editorial fairness is almost non-existent. Broadcasters here can be editorially and ideologically biased. Fox News on the right, MSNBC on the left. The second thing that sets the U.S. media apart is that unlike every other advanced country in the world, America does not have a publicly owned broadcaster provided with the resources, the budgets, to actually compete with privately owned media outlets. Britain has the BBC, Japan has NHK, Germany has ZDF and ARD, and Canada has the CBC. The public broadcasters here, PBS Television and National Public Radio, are tiny in comparison. So broadcasting in America is almost entirely corporate controlled.
Our starting point this week, the corporate domination of the American airwaves, the ratings and profit imperative related to that, and the effect that that has on the coverage of U.S. politics.
A new sort of gadget began to cut into reading time. It had been known as the wireless, but it gradually changed its name to radio.
The seeds of corporate hegemony in the U.S. media sector were planted in the late 1920s, when the Paley family of Philadelphia bought a small network of 16 local radio stations and turned it into CBS Radio. A few years later, Congress went to work on a communications law to govern the new media. Two senators, Robert Wagner and Henry Hatfield, tried to amend the law to reserve 25% of the radio airwaves for nonprofit and educational purposes. However, the private broadcasters lobbied against that, and they won the day. The Communications Act that passed in 1934 left no room for public broadcasting. By that time, Bill Paley had expanded CBS Radio, and the focus was not on covering the news, it was on advertising.
Most of the other countries in the developing world were deciding to create state-owned broadcast networks like the BBC in Britain. And the U.S. decided not to do that and have instead very heavily regulated private broadcast networks that would receive government licenses.
There was a fight in this country where many people thought that media was just too important to be commercial, that it had to be run by the state, by the government, or at least some large say in it. And there was simply a historical political battle that one side won.
The winners eventually, due to their immense lobbying power, were the corporate networks, NBC and CBS. And by 1934, with the passage of the Communications Act, they locked their control over American radio broadcasting, and that control soon extended when television came along and FM radio to those domains as well.
The late Edward R. Murrow came to work for Paley to do education programs for him. It was Murrow who convinced Paley that in addition to making a lot of money selling advertising,
Use Ajax, the foaming cleanser.
that Paley had a responsibility to the public, that CBS was a public trust, and that to meet the full responsibilities of that public trust, said Murrow to Paley, you need to do some broadcasts that are not just designed to make money.
We're impressed with the importance of this medium. We shall hope to learn to use it and not to abuse it.
There was also a very strong private market and a very strong tradition of private media since the founding of the country.
Fill up with SO Extra and go!
So as a result, America really didn't have a culture that would have fostered a national broadcaster, and instead what you had was the Columbia Broadcasting Service, and it tended to be private rather than state-oriented.
So between the 1940s and the 1960s, which were formative years for the global broadcasting industry, Americans did not have a public broadcaster of their own on either television or radio. Publicly owned broadcasters in other countries had already been up and running for decades, as had the big three privately owned U.S. television networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC. Finally, in 1967, Congress passed the Public Broadcasting Act, allowing for the creation of PBS television and NPR on radio. As President Lyndon Johnson put it, when he signed the Broadcasting Act into law, our nation wants more than just material wealth. We have an appetite for excellence as well. The Broadcasting Act, he said, will give a stronger voice to educational radio and television. That is the purpose of this act.
The act that brought public broadcasting into being has very beautiful language about serving as a forum for controversy and debate and allowing us to see America whole in all its diversity.
That was under actually President Lyndon Johnson, not because he was the activist on this, but he actually was pressured to protect a part of the spectrum for public radio and television that would be non-commercial, that would be there for educational reasons. And so public media was born.
Tonight is what you make it, so make it good. Look for something special on your public TV station.
Under the law, Congress defined public service broadcasting as programs for the public benefit rather than for purely commercial purposes. PBS's mission was to inform, educate, and inspire.
Tune in tonight.
However, Americans who thought that their new public channels could actually compete with their privately owned rivals were in for a disappointment. Because the way the law was written, PBS and NPR had severely restricted mandates.
Public broadcasting systems, like in Canada or Britain or much of Europe, their job was to provide a complete range of services to everyone in society. They did entertainment, they did popular stuff, but they also did journalism, they did documentaries. In America, and this is why the commercial broadcasters agreed to letting public broadcasting exist. Public broadcasters are supposed to do the programs nobody wanted to watch, that you couldn't make money off of.
Tonight, we'd like to remind you that this country faces other crises than energy, and one of them is the tomato.
They weren't allowed to put the Beatles on and have no ads.
It's a controversy that affects everyone in this country who eats tomatoes.
So they were limited for their audience right out the gate.
This is what they call in business first mover advantage. In the United States, the commercial networks came first. They had 30, 40-year head start. They built up these very big audiences. Then the public system was created, and it's what you would expect in the United States. If you create a minimally funded late system, it's going to have a very hard time catching up to the commercial systems that have much more resources and a big head start.
The initial plan was that public broadcasting would only have to go to Congress for funding every 5 years. So they would be kind of insulated from political pressure. That disappeared right out of the gate, and public broadcasters immediately had to start going to Congress every year to get their funding. And so what should have been a kind of protected space became always a hesitant thing, where they're always looking over their shoulder.
Problem number two is they started taking money from enormously wealthy people. Now, it seems like that's nice charity and wonderful. They're giving back, and you get to have independent media. except a lot of times that money comes with strings attached, so that media becomes less and less independent. Perfect example for PBS is the Koch brothers didn't like a documentary that PBS ran. Hey, great, they ran it anyway. Good independent media.
The rich here haven't just used their money to buy fancy cars, private jets, and mansions. They've also used it to rig the game in their favor.
But then there was a second documentary about the Koch brothers, and the PBS got a little nervous about how unpleased their benefactor was at the last documentary, so they pulled it. And there goes independent media.
Lacking a public broadcaster with the funding and the mandate to truly compete with private media means that Americans are missing more than just one channel on the dial. Such broadcasters in other countries, and Britain's BBC is just one example, tend to devote more time to news and current affairs, and they provide more international coverage.
The ceasefire in Syria, brokered by Russia and the USA, came into force about 6 hours ago.
They can affect their privately owned rivals, often forcing them to think beyond their bottom lines and raise their editorial standards. The impact of such channels can be significant, which is what the European Broadcasting Union, an alliance of broadcasters, concluded in a recent study, saying a strong and well-funded public service media is not only about providing people with news, documentaries, and entertainment, it's also about contributing to democracy. However, in the US, where so many Americans wonder how the Trump phenomenon occurred and whether the media are to blame, the public broadcasters are neither strong nor well-funded.
Remember that this country is built on both the idea and the ideal that the individual is paramount, that individual freedom is the single most important thing. Now that in the world of media, radio, television, now even the internet, that's all gotten translated into when you can keep the government out of anything, it's better. Not all Americans agree with this, but this has historically been, and increasingly is, the ethos of the country.
That same ethos, nominal government involvement in broadcasting with minimal regulations, would be reinforced in the late 1980s. The deregulation wave that changed the rules for banking, transportation, agriculture, and other American industries hit broadcasting. Up until then, broadcasters had a regulatory requirement for editorial fairness, enforced by the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC.
The Fairness Doctrine was implemented in 1949, and what it meant was that if radio and television stations wanted to keep their licenses, they would have to do two things: provide ample coverage of public affairs and of issues of importance to their communities, be they local or national, and that when they did that, they would have to provide more than just one side of that story. They had to be fair. The thinking behind that doctrine was along the very same lines as what broadcast regulators were doing the world over. Where differing and reasonable views existed, those views should be reflected in broadcast journalism. The Fairness Doctrine was the regulatory law of the land here in the United States for almost 4 decades, until 1987, when the FCC dispensed with it under the guiding hand of a Republican president, Ronald Reagan.
Patricia Diaz-Dennis was a commissioner at the FCC when the final vote on the Fairness Doctrine was held.
The justification for us ending the application of the so-called Fairness Doctrine was that it violated the First Amendment rights of the broadcasters. And the First Amendment is one of our strongest and most important guarantees to our democracy. Congress shall pass no law that abridges freedom of speech or of the press. And by the time we looked at this issue, there were so many more radio and television stations available to everyone. Cable had proliferated, direct broadcast satellite was coming into its own, and ever more increasing outlets for people to go for news and information. So the proliferation of channels led to the abolition of the Fairness Doctrine.
The problem with the Fairness Doctrine is it approaches politics and news in a kind of checklist mentality. It says that we're going to have a Republican and a Democrat, give them equal time even if their views are not equally popular, and that we're going to exclude some of the views on the margin which may be certainly much less popular. For example, I think third parties such as the Libertarian Party and the Green Party would have a legitimate complaint if they were not also being given a fair amount of time. It's just very hard to sort of sit at the top of the mountain, so to speak, and decide what fairness is. And one of the advantages of the free market is that it lets the people decide what fairness is by simply tuning in.
It's important to remember that the FCC Commissioner Mark Fowler described television as a toaster with pictures.
What we like to say is instead of attempting to deregulate, we want to unregulate. Because
eliminating the Fairness Doctrine was about saying there's nothing special about media. We don't need to regulate it in any particular way at all. But the principles that it represented, that those who control them have tremendous responsibilities, and that those responsibilities are primarily to the public. That was what the Fairness Doctrine said, and those ideas having been sort of laughed away and then actually legislated out of existence has had a tremendous and a negative impact.
It was brilliant to call it the Fairness Doctrine because who can be against fairness? If I had been around in the early days of its development at the FCC, I would have said, let's call it for what it is. The government wants to tell you what to broadcast, but I doubt that the public would have gone for that too.
3 out of 4 Americans believe the news media is biased.
Getting rid of the Fairness Doctrine is, what opened the way to Fox News, to some extent later MSNBC, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, many conservative talkers who deliver up these hot-blooded opinions.
What's going on here, Colonel? I'm not a military expert, but this sounds like one of the most ill-conceived military missions I've ever heard of.
And that's become a major theme in at least cable broadcast and talk radio journalism. And to my mind, it's a clear product of the deregulation of broadcasting.
Again, let me thank you from the bottom of my heart, every one of you, for making this great day for America possible. Thank you.
The second deregulatory step the U.S. took was the passing in 1996 of the Telecommunications Act under a Democratic president, Bill Clinton. The new law brought an end to cross-ownership restrictions, which the FCC had put in place in 1975 and had prevented the same proprietor from owning more than one media outlet in the same market. Ending those restrictions allowed Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation to own the New York Post and the Wall Street Journal in the same city, as well as Fox News. And the consolidation pattern did not end with News Corp and Murdoch. A little more than 30 years ago, in 1983, 90% of U.S. media was controlled by 50 companies. By 2010, 96% of U.S. media was in the hands of a half-dozen companies, the so-called Big Six, and they owe much of their growth to the changes contained in the Telecommunications Act.
The Telecommunications Act that allowed all those major media corporations to swallow up all of their competition and become clear, obvious oligopolies. Well, that's a disaster. That we can't have. But the problem was those same corporations were the ones funding the politicians. So the politicians said, oh, golly gee, I think you're right. I think it'd be lovely to have oligopolies. Buy away.
That really did have a huge impact in terms of concentration in the media industry. In some communities, it really has meant now there's one guy who owns everything, who owns the newspaper and the TV and the radio station, and you can't get in a word edgewise around that point of view. It was just that kind of concentration of power that folks were trying to avoid when they came up with those public interest obligations and when they came up with things like the Fairness Doctrine.
About 10 years ago, 2 decades after the Fairness Doctrine had been rescinded, some Democratic politicians in Washington started talking about the need to reinstate it. The primary reason they offered as justification was to limit the effects that one-sided and conservative talk radio was having on American political discourse. However, President Obama said he opposed the idea, and the White House has since argued that placing caps on media ownership limiting the number of outlets that one owner can have and strengthening public broadcasting was the better way to reform the American media. But in the almost 10 years since, that hasn't happened. So, as Americans like to say, the U.S. broadcasting landscape is what it is, often partisan and almost completely dominated by corporate interests, whose ultimate loyalty is not to the public good, but to their shareholders, their ratings, and to their bottom lines.
All of which can drive coverage, which brings us to the Trump campaign. The Tyndall Report is a media monitoring site that does the math. It added up the network news coverage on CBS, NBC, and ABC for the early primaries in 2015. 1/3 of it was spent on Donald Trump, swamping his Republican rivals and more airtime than the entire Democratic field combined. The 24-hour news channels were every bit as addicted to the candidate.
Thank you for sitting down with me.
And not just Fox News, a conservative outlet inclined to favor Republicans. CNN and MSNBC also gorged themselves on Trump coverage.
You're very successful, there's no question.
Their bias had more to do with ratings than a shared ideology with the candidate.
Thank you, Trump. Thanks for coming over. Coming up.
According to MediaQuant, an analytics firm that measures the value of news coverage, which is free, versus advertising, which must be paid for, all that coverage was worth more than $1.8 billion to Trump. Again, no other candidate came close. No longer constrained by the Fairness Doctrine, the networks were able to prioritize their profits over even the semblance of editorial balance. And Donald Trump was the prime beneficiary.
I humbly and gratefully accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
The main problem with corporate media seeing the audience really as consumers and not as citizens is that they don't start from people's concerns. One example of that, we had two real outsider candidacies at one point, Donald Trump on the Republican side and Bernie Sanders. ABC News in the first 11 months of last year devoted 81 minutes of coverage to Donald Trump.
Donald Trump is here right now.
Donald Trump and what he said today about
Donald Trump front and center.
Donald Trump on the attack.
Donald Trump under fire again.
And 20 seconds to Bernie Sanders. That's a news network making a decision.
What happened is when Trump starts to take off, the news media are just giving him light and water and sunshine and grow, baby, grow.
Mr. Trump joins us now.
Let's talk to Mr. Trump himself.
Donald, good morning.
Mr. Trump, good morning.
Live from Trump Tower.
New York has very much been Trump, 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 Trump.
And when Sanders came along, they were heaping concrete top of it, trying to bury it.
But does Bernie Sanders really care about the future of the Democratic Party?
How can any kind of socialist win a general election in the United States?
The corporate media is the establishment, and that's why we have the kind of media we do in America. So, for example, Hillary Clinton is far more pleasant to corporate interests. She's amiable to their boards. She is keen to serve them as she has in the past. So that is why Time Warner and Comcast are among her top 10 donors.
We sort of speak our mind. For better or worse, sometimes for candidates, for you sometimes worse.
Make her laugh.
No,
right at the top.
but
There's a reason why they have given her, in my opinion, enormously friendly coverage through the primaries.
Are your competitive juices flowing for the chance to be the first female president?
Because the idea was Bernie Sanders would overturn the apple cart. Well, whose apple cart is it? It's the corporate media's apple cart. And those same politicians that are in power and the same corporations that are in power.
CNN is not responsible for Donald Trump. They're not responsible for Hillary Clinton. What they are responsible for is greatly accentuating tendencies. They can blow on the flames of some fires and douse out others, and that can have great influence.
CNN's ratings and revenues are both way up in this campaign, but the network's president, Jeff Zucker, says that the critics of Donald Trump are looking for people to blame for his rise. I only wish that CNN had that much power to be able to create a front runner on either side. CNN alone does not have that power. However, when combined with the rest of the corporate-owned media, along with conservative talk radio, all of which were boosting Trump's profile while boosting their own ratings, And with no publicly owned player in the mix to offer an alternative, the media playing field was tilted in favor of one candidate. Which brings us back to the aforementioned CBS chairman, Les Moonves.
It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. The money's rolling in, and, this is going to be a very good year for us. It's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Go ahead. Keep going.
We've reached a point now in the 21st century where the head of a major network can say that sort of thing, and it barely gets noticed. Frankly, it's been underreported by the American media. What a thing to say. But what it tells you is that the transformation is now complete from having a sense of public service and news as a public service in the public interest to viewing a news operation now as being strictly in the corporate interest.
Problem is, the media is extremely important. It's essential to the functioning of a democratic society. It's not just a private corporation. They use the public airwaves, and they have a responsibility to use them responsibly. It's the way we learn about the world. It's the way the rest of the world learns about the United States. And we have to hear from voices other than we get in the corporate media, this media elite.
The party conventions are the crowning moments for the nominees and a litmus-like ratings test for broadcasters. Add up the viewing figures from both the Republican and Democratic conventions, and the top 6 channels, the most watched, have all been privately owned, the corporate players, with the publicly owned PBS behind them. However, ask Americans, as the Pew Research Center did in 2014, which news sources they actually trust, and that list turns upside down. All 6 big corporate outlets are less trusted than not only PBS, but also the BBC, a publicly funded and still heavily regulated British broadcaster. In short, Americans in search of news and information watch television channels that relatively few of them trust. And the choice that Americans have been left with come November is between 2 candidates who seem to be more popular with broadcasters, whose size and revenues are growing, than they are with voters who feel that their influence is shrinking.
So the media has played a central role in both sides, both parties, for the worse in each case. And in both cases, in the first case because of their political biases towards mainstream, in the second case because of their immense commercial biases to make money as much as possible, they've shaped the election going into the general elections this fall.
What's critical is these monopolies. And these days, the same corporations who own radio, television, and newspapers are owning large swaths of the internet, which is why we have to fight to keep the internet open and free. It was built with public funds, and now corporations would like to privatize it because, of course, it is so incredibly lucrative for them. But we can't let that happen. You could only imagine what would happen if it was a level playing field. We need a media that presents that level playing field.
I believe that we can change this entire paradigm. I think that the source of the problem is the money in politics. The government's been taken over by corporate interests through legalizing corporate donations to politicians. And so now they do whatever they want, and the news is another form of entertainment. So, constitutional amendment to get money out of politics is the answer.
No industry likes to be regulated, and journalism is no different from any other industry. I was dean of Columbia Journalism School for 10 years, and on every occasion I could find, I would say there should be more public broadcasting and more regulated broadcasting in the United States. I never found literally a single person who agreed with me, ever, among journalists, including, the so-called liberal media. Journalists are really trained to think government regulation is okay, except when it applies to journalism, in which case it's absolute moral wrong. So if that's what you believe, this is the world you get.
To sum it up, Americans are living under a bombardment of media output, almost all of it corporately produced, but with a critical shortage of balance and an absence of a major publicly funded broadcast player. Come November, voters who, as the saying goes, want to make America great again, might want to start right there by reforming their news media, the people and the institutions that are telling their story. You've been watching a special edition of our program from New York. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.